The water crisis unfolding in Corpus Christi, Texas, has become one of the most alarming environmental and infrastructure emergencies in recent American history. At the center of this crisis is Lake Corpus Christi, a reservoir that once symbolized long-term water security for the Texas Gulf Coast. In a shocking turn of events, the lake lost nearly 90% of its water capacity within a single day, leaving residents, officials, and industry stunned. What was once a dependable source of water for nearly 500,000 people has now become a stark reminder of how vulnerable modern cities are when environmental pressures collide with political decisions, industrial expansion, and failed planning. Lake Corpus Christi had served the region for decades, supporting households, businesses, agriculture, and some of the largest industrial operations in Texas. Yet the reservoir suddenly dropped to less than 10% of its total capacity, exposing dry lake beds and creating widespread fear about the future of the region's water supply. The crisis did not emerge overnight, however. While drought played a major role, the disaster is also rooted in years of policy failures, overdependence on limited resources, and the prioritization of industrial growth over long-term sustainability. The collapse of Lake Corpus Christi is not an isolated problem. Nearby reservoirs, including Choke Canyon Reservoir, have also reached dangerously low levels. Combined, the two reservoirs now hold less than 10% of the water that once sustained the area for generations. This dramatic decline has raised urgent concerns about whether the region can continue functioning without major disruptions to daily life and economic activity. The drought affecting the Texas Gulf Coast has intensified over several years, reducing rainfall and shrinking river flows. Experts warn that if dry conditions continue, the Nueces River system, which feeds these reservoirs, could eventually stop flowing altogether. The consequences of this water shortage extend far beyond inconvenience. Residents have already reported visible signs of environmental stress. Ground cracking and shifting home foundations have appeared as the soil dries out and loses moisture. Infrastructure across the region is becoming increasingly vulnerable, and experts fear these effects will worsen if water levels continue to decline. Wildfire risks are also rising as vegetation dries out and ecosystems struggle to survive in extreme heat and lack of rainfall. Despite the growing danger, local authorities have struggled to provide clear and effective solutions. Corpus Christi City Council approved nearly $50 million in emergency water projects, but many of these plans remain incomplete or delayed. Residents are increasingly frustrated by what they see as a lack of urgency and preparedness. The crisis has exposed a troubling disconnect between official reassurances and the reality on the ground. One of the most controversial aspects of the situation is the role of industry in consuming the region's water supply. Corpus Christi has experienced rapid industrial growth over the past decade, especially after the shale oil boom transformed the Texas Gulf Coast into a major center for energy production and exports. Massive refineries, chemical plants, and manufacturing facilities now dominate the region's economy. These industries consume enormous quantities of water, far more than residential users. In fact, industrial facilities account for roughly 80% of the region's water consumption. One of the most striking examples is the Gulf Coast Growth Ventures plastics plant, a multi-billion-dollar project linked to ExxonMobil and Saudi Arabia's national oil company. Since operations began in 2022, the facility has consumed approximately 25 million gallons of drinking quality water every day, an amount equal to the daily water use of the entire population of Corpus Christi. Other industrial operations, including major steel manufacturing facilities, also rely heavily on the same shrinking reservoirs. This imbalance has fueled public outrage because many industrial users are exempt from strict drought restrictions. Under policies established years earlier, large companies are allowed to continue operating at near normal levels even during severe shortages. Meanwhile, residents face penalties and mandatory restrictions for relatively minor uses, such as watering lawns or washing vehicles. Critics argue that the system effectively allows wealthy corporations to buy access to water, while ordinary citizens bear the burden of conservation. Supporters of these exemptions argue that refineries and chemical plants cannot easily reduce water use without creating dangerous safety risks. These facilities depend on constant water flow to cool machinery and maintain safe operations. Sudden reductions could lead to overheating, equipment failures, or even explosions, Nevertheless, the inability to reduce industrial demand has made the region's water management system dangerously inflexible during a time of crisis. Another major factor in the disaster is the failure of Corpus Christi's long-promised desalination project. For years, city leaders promoted a large desalination plant as a solution to future water shortages. The facility was intended to convert seawater into drinking water, reducing dependence on reservoirs and creating a more stable supply for both residents and industry. Initially approved in 2019, the desalination project carried a price tag of around $140 million and was expected to produce 10 million gallons of water daily. However, as plans expanded to meet growing industrial demand, costs skyrocketed. By 2025, estimates exceeded $1 billion. Public confidence collapsed as critics accused officials of poor planning, unrealistic projections, and mismanagement. After heated debates and political conflict, the city ultimately canceled the project entirely. The cancellation left Corpus Christi without the alternative water source it had counted on for nearly a decade. Not a single gallon of desalinated water was ever produced. Meanwhile, industries that had been promised long-term water access continued expanding operations. Critics argue that the city guaranteed water supplies to corporations before securing the infrastructure needed to support them, creating a dangerous mismatch between promises and reality. As reservoir levels continued falling, officials turned to emergency groundwater projects as a backup strategy. Plans were developed to pump water from the Evangeline Aquifer, located roughly 20 miles from Corpus Christi. The city hoped the aquifer could provide up to 20 million gallons of water daily to help offset declining reservoir levels. However, this plan quickly triggered legal and political conflict. The nearby city of Sinton, which also relies on the aquifer, filed lawsuits to block the permits required for Corpus Christi's emergency pumping operations. Sinton's leaders argued that their own residents deserved equal protection and feared excessive groundwater extraction could threaten their community's future water security. This dispute highlights a larger issue affecting drought-prone regions across the United States. Water scarcity often creates competition between neighboring communities. As supplies shrink, cooperation becomes more difficult, and legal battles over water rights intensify. In Corpus Christi's case, these delays threaten to undermine one of the few remaining emergency options available before reservoirs reach critically unusable levels. The stakes are especially high because Corpus Christi is not just another city. It is one of the most important energy hubs in the country. The region hosts the nation's leading port for crude oil exports and contains refineries critical to fuel production and national energy markets. If water shortages force these facilities to shut down, the consequences could extend far beyond Texas. A prolonged industrial shutdown could disrupt fuel supplies, increase energy prices, and affect transportation and manufacturing across the country. Jet fuel production for major airports could also be interrupted. Economically, the impact on the local region would be devastating. Thousands of jobs tied directly or indirectly to refinery operations could disappear, leading to widespread unemployment and financial instability. Experts familiar with the region's water system have described the current situation in extremely serious terms. Former water officials and engineers have warned that Corpus Christi is facing the worst water emergency in decades. Some have suggested the city could eventually return to conditions resembling those from generations ago, when residents depended on hauling water manually because centralized systems were inadequate. The crisis also reflects broader environmental and climate-related challenges facing Texas and other rapidly growing regions. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of droughts, while population growth and industrial expansion continue placing greater pressure on already limited water resources. Corpus Christi has effectively become a warning sign for what could happen elsewhere if infrastructure planning fails to keep pace with demand. The city's future now depends on several uncertain factors. Significant rainfall could temporarily relieve pressure on reservoirs, but officials estimate that recovery will require 20 to 30 inches of rain, an amount usually associated with hurricanes or major tropical storms. Without such rainfall, emergency restrictions and water shortages may become unavoidable. At the same time, many emergency plans remain incomplete. Officials have admitted the city lacks the infrastructure to effectively enforce major water cuts during a severe emergency. This means that even if restrictions are declared, implementing them across industrial systems and residential areas may prove difficult or impossible. Public trust is also eroded as residents question whether leaders were adequately prepared for a crisis many experts warned about years earlier. The combination of delayed action, failed infrastructure projects, industrial favoritism, and environmental decline has created a sense that the disaster was not simply caused by nature, but by preventable human decisions. Ultimately, the collapse of Lake Corpus Christi represents more than a regional water shortage. It reveals a fragile balance between economic growth, environmental sustainability, and responsible governance. For years, prosperity along the Texas Gulf Coast depended on the assumption that water supplies would remain secure. That assumption has now been shattered. The unfolding crisis serves as a powerful lesson about the consequences of delayed planning and competing priorities. It demonstrates how drought alone does not create catastrophe. Rather, disaster emerges when environmental stress collides with systems unprepared to adapt. Corpus Christi now stands at a crossroads. The decisions made in the coming months and years will determine whether the region can recover and build a more resilient future, or whether it will become a cautionary tale for other cities facing similar pressures around the world.